So we are a couple minutes after 10, so we will get started here. Good morning and welcome to this Workforce Wednesday webinar. My name is Elizabeth Yoder with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University. I will be the moderator and technical support for today's webinar. Today's topic is creating a culture for courageous conversation. As a reminder, all participants in the webinar do not have the ability to unmute themselves. If you have questions as the webinar proceeds, please post them in the chat box or the Q&A, and we will address them throughout and at the end of the webinar when we pause for Q&A. This webinar is recorded. The presentation recordings and any materials presented during today's meeting will be available on the Illinois Workforce Academy website within 48 hours of today's session. I will put the link to the presentation for today in the chat momentarily. To be as accessible as possible, this webinar will be offering closed captioning and live transcription, so feel free to turn this on using your Zoom toolbar. Tomorrow, each attendee will receive follow-up emails which will include a survey asking you about today's webinar. So please provide feedback and any suggestions you have to help improve upcoming professional development efforts. We do have 2 polls very quickly for all participants to answer, so we will launch those right now. Looks like we have almost 100% answered on this poll, and then we can quickly move on to the next one, and Carmen will begin her presentation.
Did you need so they can't do they are you going to share their responses with them? Because they can't see them right now, right? Or do you need them to?
I don't think we need them to.
Okay.
Yeah, it's more for data collection.
Okay.
So, are we seeing the results? Oh, here we go. So, good variety.
Hmm.
All right, if Carmen, you would like to get started, we will
Sure.
move along.
All right, fantastic. So good morning, everyone. I'm Carmen Stewart. I've been working in adult literacy for 18 years, and I always love presenting to other adult educators. So thank you for joining me for creating a culture for courageous conversations. I would encourage you to grab a notepad or a journal or writing utensil or pull up a blank document on your computer because I'm going to I'm going to give you a couple scenarios and give you some things to think about, ask you some questions that you might actually want to jot down your response to it, just so that you can get this is a conversation. Having courageous conversations can often evoke emotions. And I want you to have a space to spill them. Even though I'll give you opportunities to talk in the chat, but I want you to have a space to kind of think through some things, spill, to just get it out of your system if you need to as we're going through this session, or to write down questions that you might want to think about a little bit later. And I'll also ask you to take a moment to type some responses into the chat just so we can make this as interactive as possible. So I'd like to start off by asking you each to introduce yourself in a cultural way. And what that means is I want you to tell us a little bit about yourself. Like, what is your name? Where did your name come from? Does it have any cultural or personal significance to it, or the meaning of it? So if you could just do that in the chat for me, give you all time to do that. And while you all do that, I'm going to okay. Dr. Williams, Swahili for perfect. That's fantastic. Ruby's named after her grandmother. Jacqueline, mother said she named me after Jackie Kennedy. Name is Amy. It has no cultural significance. Okay. The first and middle name, Lacey Anna, for my grandmother and great grandmother. Born in Iowa to German and English parents. Okay. Mother to three boys who are African American. One of them is Hispanic. Okay. Name from a song my father was in love with. Oh, Norma de la Guadalajara. Dimitri, and that's the name of Saint Dimitri. Okay, beautiful. Kelly, middle name is Marie. Middle name was a family name. Paul Wayne, named after his father, named after a person at your mom's job. No idea of the meaning. Last name is Polish. Actually means rabbit. Okay, wonderful. Janet Wright means gift from God. Okay, fantastic. These are great answers. Okay, last name is French. There's a city and castle in France called, is it Vol? They don't typically pronounce the X, right? Anita Kerr, that's a familiar name named after a musical group like my dad, that your dad liked. Okay. All right. German name my grandfather cut in half in the early 20th century to sound less German. Okay. Okay. All right. Beth Stevens, and no, it doesn't have any cultural significance. All right. Fantastic. So I just want to start off by saying that we can have conversations that are cultural conversations, and we'll see just this little introductory activity is a safe and simple way to start introducing the idea of diversity into your organization. Because as you can see through all of the responses, that some people are just like, my name has no cultural significance whatsoever, or I was named after something, like I have this really noble meaning for my name, or I was named after a family member. So our diversity doesn't necessarily have to be about cultural diversity, but starting off with something very simple like this allows you to see the ways that people in your organization who may be different demographically or in relation to their social identity, but still have a lot of things in common. So you might want to group people by how many folks are named after someone in their family, or who are the people who feel like there's no cultural significance to name, or whose name means something really powerful and noble. And so these are just simple ways to start acknowledging diversity in a safe, simple way. And I say that because often when we have conversations around diversity, we start off with race, and that just polarizes people and shuts the entire conversation down. So this is just an introduction, just a way for you to think about how are some ways that you can celebrate the diversity of your team, and creating a work culture where diversity is something that's talked about and celebrated in non-threatening ways initially, because you want to start off with ways that ease people into the conversation. So thank you all, first of all, for those. It's all really, really interesting. I wish I had time to read them all, but I have 90 minutes to cover a lot of stuff. So thank you for doing that. Again, this is just a way to like introduce the idea of diversity in a safe and a fun way, and that allows you to identify commonalities, allows you to identify where your differences are, and that could also help you figure out like how you might want to group people in an activity around diversity. So today our agenda is to talk about why why we have courageous conversations. Why should we do them? I'd like to create just a basic understanding of DEI because if you're going to have conversations around diversity, it's important to have a common language and common vocabulary around those topics, and just really an understanding of how we go from our identity to the different isms, racism, sexism, transgenderism, et cetera, cisgenderism, whatever. And so I want to create that understanding. We'll talk a little bit about microaggressions, micro assaults, and micro insults and what they are and how they can impact learners and instruction and our coworkers, in fact. I'll give you an activity that I like to use. I think we all have blind spots, and it's important to be able to check ourselves with relation to those blind spots. So I'll give you an activity for that. And then we'll talk about how to create a culture for conversations and then what are the steps for having courageous conversations within your organization. Okay. So starting with part one, why courageous conversations. So I'm going to start by actually putting a scenario on the screen. I'm sorry. I'm going to start by putting a scenario on the screen. And here's what I want you to think about. I'm going to actually ask you to think about what your response would be to this scenario. Okay. And so I'll put the scenario responses on the screen in a moment. But the scenario is this. So your team is engaging in some training around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and one member of your team would clearly rather be anywhere else. They are interrupting the trainer. They're making inappropriate remarks. They don't return from breaks on time. Their behavior is just really distracting the whole entire room. They've commented that they don't feel that racism is a problem in your organization, that sexism is a problem in your organization, and they feel like the company's efforts are just a way to say, hey, we've done it because everyone else is doing it, okay? So thinking about that scenario, what would your response typically be? Thinking about your comfort level with these conversations. Would your response be, number one, I'm going to mind my business and say nothing? Would it be number two, to speak to leadership and ask them to intervene? Would it be three, to speak privately to the disruptive coworker, maybe at the next break? Or would it be number four, to just confront the coworker publicly because he's getting on your nerves? So think about that scenario. And what would be your response? I see a couple threes. I see quite a few threes. Number two, some threes and twos. No one's going for the four. Oh, there is someone going for the four. Kelly's going for the four. Okay, see a couple more twos in there. No ones. Okay, two fours. All right, yes. Rachel, depending on the relationship, absolutely. All right, I see three fours. One or four, but more diplomatically than that. Okay, thanks, Kim. That's a great response. Okay, one or three, depending on the work climate. Realistically, would be a one because of bystander bias. Brent, do you mind unmuting and saying a little bit about that? Or can you unmute in the webinar setting?
No, they can't.
They can't unmute. Okay. Oh, I really want to know, Brent. I want to hear a little bit more about that. Realistically, one or two because of bystander bias. Okay. All right. Okay, you can't. Okay. Um, okay, Rebecca says, however, if you're not management, you really can't say a word. Okay, so let me just ask you, if for someone who responds with response option one, like I'm minding my business, I'm not going to say anything. What do you think? And please feel free to type a response in the chat if you'd like to, although I'm not asking everyone to. But what do you think would be the response? What is your lack of response, your silence? What does that communicate to the person who's being disruptive? Silence only helps the oppressor, Nancy says. Okay, let's just start out with the power. Jesus, come bringing it with both barrels early in. Okay. Um, that it's condoned, that it's okay, our approval, that the behavior is accepted, it's okay for them to continue. Yes. And it also, yes, absolutely, it can allow the attitude of the disruptor to spread. It communicates that you approve. Okay, beautiful. So thank you all so much for that. And then also think about not only what your silence communicates to the person who's being disruptive, but what does it also say to other people who are in the room maybe we're talking about disability. And maybe this person's making ignorant comments about people with disabilities, and you have a coworker in the room who's disabled. When you don't say anything while that person's going off about disability, what does it communicate to that coworker who's a part of that marginalized group? What does it say to them? Right? Probably makes them feel isolated, probably makes them feel like no one's really supporting them. Um, Probably makes them feel like other people agree with it. It invalidates their experience. So I can see Nancy is quick on the draw and has a lot to say. I really appreciate that. Okay, wonderful. It does invalidate their experiences. And probably many of you on this call have experienced that before, where you just wish that someone else would say something. Well, when we don't have a culture for courageous, when we don't create a culture for courageous conversations within our workspaces, it makes it difficult for people to speak up, and it puts people in a very awkward situation. And it makes me, this is not a part of our slideshow, but I think this is a good moment to talk about allies and accomplices. An ally is someone who sees the wrong, who hears the comments, who's just as bothered by the comments, but who feels like number one is the best option for them. I'm not gonna say anything. I'm gonna just stay out of it. An accomplice is someone who agrees with you, who believes the things that you believe, but who will put their own self in harm's way if necessary to stand up for that wrong or to try to right that wrong. So if you create a culture for courageous conversations, you're more likely to create accomplices in your workplace for marginalized folks than if you don't do that. Okay, so moving on, let's look at why should we have courageous conversations? So first of all, we do not live, most of us can live in communities that are pretty homogenous and smaller communities, but in the world itself, our world is getting a lot smaller. So our personal worlds are becoming a lot more diverse. So there are benefits to having courageous conversations. First of all, if you have a courageous conversation, you can actually learn new information about an issue, gain new perspectives, and improve your own understanding about diversity and difference. Um, Engaging in courageous conversations helps you to deepen trust and respect, and helps you to prevent resentment. So again, if we go back to that scenario where there's a coworker who's disabled, when no one speaks up for that coworker, they may resent everyone in the room, right? So engaging in courageous conversations helps to prevent that resentment. Silence can be taken as indifference. And then I see a comment, mostly in today's workplace environment, hostility is a real problem. I'm a stand-up person. My question would be, why didn't the leader or management call that employee to the side or excuse them? That's a very good question. And I think that sometimes, I'll tell you two things that I think that I've seen. The first is that sometimes management doesn't confront things because they don't want their confrontation averse. So they don't want to create the tension between themselves and that employee. That definitely is a situation where leadership could intervene. But another reason that leadership might intervene is maybe they agree. Maybe they feel the same way. So it could be very different. They could be resentful of the training, as Nancy's also saying. So engaging in these conversations also helps improve communication because you learn to listen a little bit differently, and you learn to hold your opinion so you can hear someone else's perspective and to consider that perspective before you go back to offering your own opinion. It can also help you improve problem solving skills within your organization, just like working together to try to find a solution rather than ignoring a situation altogether. It can increase your own personal growth, your own emotional intelligence as you're engaging in conversations. It can help you broaden your perspective of the world and to help you see how other people see things, which makes you more sensitive, which is part of the emotional intelligence. And it can also keep you from feeling stuck in an issue where it's like, oh, we've had this conversation 10 times and we've never moved anywhere forward. If you create a culture for courageous conversations, it makes it easier to not feel like you're stuck in the same place. And the other thing is, when you talk about issues, sometimes when you don't talk about an issue, it feels like, okay, well, we haven't talked about it. It hasn't reared its face. It's probably going to go away. And what's true is that's probably not going to go away on its own. And so what you could actually be doing is creating a bigger conflict. So having courageous conversations can prevent those things from becoming the straw that broke the camel's back, and prevent it from becoming a bigger issue than it has to be. So some challenges. If you don't have courageous conversations, you risk creating resentment. Again, if you have folks in your organization who are underrepresented and they don't hear they don't feel respected, if they don't feel heard, and you never have the conversation, it can start to build a resentment with them where eventually they're probably going to depart from your organization because they don't feel valued and appreciated and validated in their lived experiences. Now, I think of there was a story when Barack Obama was president, and they would talk about the fact that his cabinet was so diverse, but that the women in his cabinet felt like they weren't necessarily heard, and so they would, you know, share an idea or share a thought in a meeting, and then they might be interrupted by a male counterpart. And so, what the women in his administration started doing is they would amplify one another's voices. So, I might say, well, I think that we should, and someone might interrupt me, or I might say, I think we should do A, B, and C. And then someone else could just completely step on my comment. And then Sarah might say, oh, Carmen, I think I really like what Carmen said when she said blah, blah, blah. And so she just kind of like puts my comment back in the center. What does that do for our whole group? As it helps us to consider an idea that might have been just dismissed on the fact that I'm a female offering that idea, right? Even subconsciously, but it also is affirming for me as her colleague that she heard me, she valued what I said, and she valued it enough to support me publicly, right? I'm gonna tell you one of the worst things that I've experienced in my career is when I felt something that I really believed and I shared it with the administration or the powers that be, and no one said anything. And then I go back to my office and everyone wants to come in and say, I'm so glad that you said that. Like, great, but why did you leave me out there by myself? That was an opportunity for you to support me. So you can create resentment when you don't say anything. It can also lead to just a really toxic work environment where people will say, won't say things, or they get to the point where they just don't even want to talk and interact with people. I can think of another organization in adult literacy, which I actually won't name, but there was an organization in adult literacy that after 2020 was doing all of this work around, I mean, everything that they put out they had all of these diversity, equity, and inclusion task forces and all of these initiatives. And their staff and their volunteers and their AmeriCorps visitors were saying, it's great that you're doing all of these outward things, but internally, here's what we're experiencing and here's what we're feeling. And here's where we don't see DEI. So it's like you've got all of this talk, but there's no real action. And so they were saying that and having that conversation over and over and over. And when they felt like they weren't listened to, they wrote a 51-page response to that of their experiences, and they published it and distributed it broadly. And that sent all kinds of shockwaves throughout that organization. Executive director ended up changing. I think they changed their name eventually. So not responding to it can create bigger issues down the road if you're not careful, because the message that you're communicating to your external clients starts with your internal clients. Okay, and that's your coworkers, that's your students, those are the people who you are in contact with every day. Let's see. Okay. Also, avoiding conversations gets to the point where it can erode trust between coworkers and create a situation where people just don't want to collaborate. It can really strain relationships within your office, especially if someone is holding on to resentment and feeling like you had an opportunity to help and support me and you didn't. But I hear you talking about things in a way that makes it seem like you're that person, but in practice, you're not that person, right? So now I don't trust you because what I see you do is very different than what you say you're going to do. And so it can erode those relationships, those trust relationships. And that leads to a very poor work culture, which is really, really not in the best interest of anyone. So I think it's really important for us. It also starts to, when you're feeling resentment in your workplace because you don't feel respect, you don't feel seen, you don't feel heard, it kind of starts to stifle your innovation. The amount of energy that you can bring towards your tasks can be decreased when you feel like these folks don't care about what I have to contribute anyway. So why should I bring my A game to work every day? When there are conflicts, they can be escalated if you don't have a way and a process of dealing with them on a regular basis. And the other thing is, when you don't have these conversations, you miss opportunities for growth. You miss opportunities for your staff to build those relationships. And it just makes it so much easier for us all, even though it sounds like having the conversations are difficult, is easier than dealing with the fallout of avoiding those conversations altogether. All right, so let's talk about understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion, because I think that is a really key part of starting those conversations. And so I just want to say, I was trained as a diversity trainer in 2001. And from 2001 to maybe 2005, I was doing diversity trainings all the time for all kinds of corporations and colleges and universities throughout Cleveland. And then that work just stopped completely. It just wasn't something that people were talking about. They were like ebbs and flows to it. And so anytime I do a presentation now, I try to always include a rendering of Mr. George Floyd because I believe the conversations that we're having around DEI are a part of his legacy. And I want to honor that. We were not having these conversations before May 25th of 2020. And I feel like this is a way for him to live on in our circle in adult education because we're having these conversations largely as a result of his murder that was publicized when we were all home during the pandemic. So, because these conversations tend to come up around things like the film of Mr. Floyd, a lot of people are confused about what DEI means. And so, people tend to kind of associate DEI exclusively with policing in Black and Brown communities. So, they're like, what does this have to do with adult literacy? I'm a teacher. I don't have anything to do with that. So, I want to be clear about what that is. Okay. So, first, um, what I what I like to say is that DEI is not about focusing just on. It's not a benefit to non-dominant populations. It really helps everyone. It's not about trying to make people feel guilt about being part of a dominant group or having certain privileges because of things that happened in the past. No one on this call is responsible for the world that we live in today, right? But we're responsible for what we create tomorrow. So the guilt, the shame, the blame, it doesn't help us at all. So DEI isn't about that. DEI is when we intentionally work to include an array of diverse perspectives as we're building programs and services so that it's beneficial to most people. Okay. I see a comment. Okay, Kelly, thank you so much. So what I think about is I think sometimes it's easier to understand what DEI is by thinking about what things are like when DEI is absent. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of examples that I hope will hit home for you. So the first one is, do you know that women are 43% more likely to be injured and 17% more likely to die in an automobile accident? Now, why would that be? It's because the crash test dummies that are used in auto safety testing are not modeled after our bodies. Isn't that interesting, right? So if I'm a woman working for the National Transportation Safety Board and I know this, then I would naturally say, we need dummies that are modeled after women's bodies so we can make sure that these are safer for everyone, right? So DEI not being a part of National NTSB means that more women and children are probably dying in motor vehicle accidents, that women and children are more likely to die in motor vehicle accidents because we don't have all of those perspectives in the room because all of those cultures aren't being considered in the design of the safety testing. Okay, so when DEI is absent, it can relate in more depth, right? So Nancy says the whole medical industry is based on men. Absolutely, the dosages, all of that stuff, absolutely. So another thing, another example of when DEI is absent, they were looking at. There's a study in Michigan Journal of Law published a study that talked about looking at criminal justice, and one of the things that they noticed is that they looked at criminals, or they were looking at data. And when they were looking at data, they were trying to decide where is the breakdown in the social justice system. And in the first study they found, it was like, oh, it's all in how people are charged. And the judges were like, great, that has nothing to do with us. We're not a part of the bias in the justice system. So then researchers said, well, actually, let's look at the sentencing because the sentencing is under the judge's control. So they looked at people, Hispanic men, white men, African American men who were charged for committing the same crimes. Within the white race, men who had more Afrocentric features got longer sentences. Within the Hispanic race, men with more Afrocentric features got longer sentences. Within the Black race, men with more Afrocentric features got longer sentences for the exact same crime. So when you start to think about the ways that our biases are impacting people's sentences and how much time they end up spending away for their families for these crimes, you see that bias impacts everything. So as educators, DEI for us is thinking about how do we make sure that all of the inputs that we're putting into our program design, our instructional decision making, our policies, how do we make sure that they're benefiting the most people and harming the least people? That's what DEI really is all about. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's not about, you know, it's not about who's, I think we a lot often focus on black and white in this country, and it's just like you miss so much when we focus only on those things. It really is about how do we make this so that everyone's happy, so that everyone's comfortable, so that everyone gets the most benefit, so that all of our students are learning and graduating and going and transitioning. How do we do that? That's what DI is about. And it's about including students as a part of our decision making because they're the ones who are impacted by our decisions. So they should be a part of helping us decide that, right? So I don't know about in Illinois and Ohio, when you're a newly funded program, you're required to do a needs assessment. And that needs assessment is asking students, where is the need? What do you want? How is this program going to work? So that we're designing things with them in mind. That to me really is a part of DEI. So it's not just about racial categories, but age and participant versus board member versus programmer versus administrator. It's including all of those voices. Okay. So here's the thing about guilt and blame. They're not useful. They're not constructive. So if you're working on, a lot of folks who do DEI kind of come in with this posture of like, they really make people want to feel bad about what conditions are. And that's not helpful and it's not productive. And all it does is make people shut down from the very beginning. Blaming, it doesn't change anything. Action's what changes everything. And it also, I think it's important to acknowledge the ways that you may benefit from the system, the ways that others are denied access. I mean, if you think about ability and disability in this country, those of us who are non-disabled, we don't even have to think about how we move through the world, right? That's a privilege that so many of us enjoy that we don't even think about on a day-to-day basis because we don't have to, right? We don't have to think about it. And so we acknowledge the ways that we have privilege and then use our privilege to help other people. To me, people say, well, I've had people say, can you do a diversity session? Can you not talk about privilege? I'm like, no, privilege is not a bad word. Privilege really is a superpower if you think about it, right? I think about at the beginning of the Trump administration when that Muslim ban was first put in place, it went nowhere. And why did it go nowhere? It went nowhere because people who have non-Muslim privilege were showing up at state houses and at airports and and just saying like this is not okay, right? So privilege is a superpower. It's using your advantage in service of other people who don't have that same advantage. Okay, so one last point is that there's a gosh, I can't think of the name of it right now. It's escaping me. But the idea is that if we're not working to dismantle these systems, then we're keeping them in place. We're working to support them. So we have to think about what are we doing? Am I dismantling oppression or am I enabling it? One or the other. We can't really be neutral. And I think Nancy said that a little bit earlier. So let's see. Okay, um, so let's talk about a couple of key terms I think are important to define whenever we're talking about bias, DEI, et cetera. And the first one is identity. So identity is our social group representation. We're all a part of different social identity groups, whether that's race, whether that's gender, whether it's socioeconomic class, whether it's, it could be any your religious affiliation, our education level groupings. So think about the different social identity groups that you belong to. And then tell us which social identity do you feel is most representative of who you are? Jennifer, being a mother. Absolutely. Does it dominate your every thought and breath, right? Okay. Nice. Okay. 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 Okay, so I can't tell you how many times my brothers were pulled over as teenagers driving my parents' Hondas in our very diverse community. Never ticketed, never cited ever, but pulled over on a regular basis. There's so much pressure around GED students and how they can cause trouble. Absolutely. Not receiving opportunities to do more work because you struggle with aspects of your job because of neurodivergence. Absolutely. And I think we're seeing that more and more. And I'm hoping that our world is starting to shift. Um, I see ways that we're beginning to appreciate neurodivergence and to kind of create opportunities where people can work within their gifts. I would like to see more of that, especially in adult education. Okay, great. So discrimination is when someone has acted on their prejudice towards you and followed you around the store or not giving you an opportunity or not believe that you had a disability because they couldn't see it. So that is discrimination. Discrimination is the point where we have a choice. Okay. All right, so the last concept that we're going to talk about is the isms, okay? And the isms are where we have discrimination plus power, okay? So before we really talk about that, I want to give you just a really quick prompt. And this, so forgive me, this is not going to be appropriate for everyone. And I don't want you to participate if you're not comfortable with it. But if you are comfortable, if you identify as straight, I'd like you to share your experience of coming out as straight. How did your parents react, respond? You know, how did your peer group treat you when you came out as straight? Nancy says, not even a blip, right? And Sarah's looking at me like, Carmen, what kind of question is this, right? I'm asking that because we don't even have that experience. We don't have to. That's our privilege, right? But yeah, Lacey, it was just assumed. So there were no issues. Absolutely. It wasn't even necessary. You guys get it, right? And so that is discrimination plus power. Only folks who are not the norm have to come out. And they come out over and over and over to family, to friends, to everyone they meet. They're constantly coming out. We don't have that. If you're straight cisgender, you don't ever have that experience, right? And so that's those are the isms. That's where the power there's once you're if you're a part of the dominant group and you're discriminating, then you have power. So here's an example of that. As a woman, I can have an interview. I could be interviewing for a position. And interviewing for that position, let's say I use Sarah and Elizabeth just because they're on the panel, but let's say Sarah and Elizabeth and I are looking for a coworker and there's a man who interviews for the position and we choose like, oh, we're just not going to hire this guy, right? We're not going to hire him. We really are looking for a woman to be on this panel. Okay. Is it discriminatory that the three of us decide that we're not going to look for a man? Absolutely. Is it sexism? No, because we can only control what happens in this little organization. But the three of us aren't keeping men from being promoted in positions all over because men are in the position of power. There are very few spaces where women are controlling hiring, right? So women can definitely be discriminatory in their hiring. They can't be sexist. Does that make sense? If you're lacking that element of power, you can definitely be discriminatory, but you don't reach the level of an ism until you have the power behind it. Okay. All right. So, um, so I use this exercise with my students who are in the college and university classes because I want them to think about like I really have the right journal experience about coming out as straight. And I think it's because that's one it really makes people think about like, okay, I do have this privilege that I don't really didn't really recognize that I had. We don't even think about it. The fact it's not even a conversation for most of us that you know that that's our privilege. Okay, so let's talk about this cycle with an example of how we go from identity to isms, right? So if you identify as non-disabled, and 74% of Americans do identify as non-disabled, right? So if you identify as non-disabled, your bias could be that you believe people with disabilities are less capable, right? And why wouldn't you? Because culturally, that's how if you think about the movies that you've seen with someone with a disability or the TV shows that feature someone with a disability. First of all, you might be like, what shows do that? right? But when you do see someone in a movie with a disability, they're not presented as a person who has this whole personality, like their whole character is based on their disability, right? Or if someone is LGBTQI plus, their whole character, like sometimes I'll say to people, like, I would love for someone to just cast, like, this is part of the reason why I love Hamilton. They just picked who could sing and dance. They didn't really pick, it wasn't really based on race. I would love to see a movie where they just write a script and just cast people. Like I would love to see movies where Black people are just having regular people issues. Like all my issues aren't Black issues. A lot of my issues are just issues, right? We're all looking for the best groceries. We're all looking for the best deal for a car. Like there are some things that just are about life that we all share, that we all share. We tend to focus on those things because that's how we're conditioned, right? So we've been told in so many different ways, even if someone explicitly said to you, we've gotten this message over and over that people with disabilities are less capable. And because of that, our prejudice might be that a candidate who comes in might be less qualified or more difficult to work with than a candidate who comes in who doesn't have a disability. Okay. So that's just automatic. Our identity, our bias, our prejudice, those are the things that we can't control. But when we make the conscious decision to choose a less qualified candidate or equal qualified candidate just because that person isn't disabled, we are guilty of discrimination. Okay. And because non disabled people have the power in this country, that is also ableism. That is how you go from identity to ism. Okay. And so now the unemployment rate, at least as far as I should look up the newest statistic, but in May of 2022, the unemployment rate was 7.9 for people with disabilities and 3.2 for people without disabilities. Okay. So this is the very real consequence of identifying in a way that allows us to discriminate. Okay. Does that make sense? Are y'all following me? Can I get a yes in the chat? Is everybody okay? Okay, perfect. All right. All right. So moving forward, let's talk about just unpacking that a little bit. So we've talked about our own identity and how our identities form the way that we think, our biases. And our biases, again, it's information that was downloaded from the media or from our families and the communities that we are part of, our peer groups. Thank you, Andrea. That's so correct as of the end of 2023. Thank you. So is there anyone who just really feels like, do you need a moment to just kind of jot some ideas, thoughts down about that? You want to take a moment to just kind of breathe and think through, you know, how now that you've looked at how your identity can inform your bias, and your bias can lead to prejudice decisions, and your prejudice decisions can lead to discriminatory actions. Just take a moment and unpack that. Take a moment to reflect. I'm going to stop talking so that you can do that. Norma, I can share the slides with Sarah, and then the recording, they're going to share the recording as well. So, and then just know every activity that we've done today is something you can use with your team to help facilitate a culture where courageous conversations are the norm. Mm-hmm. I'm looking at these questions in the chat. You all are, oh my goodness. Oh wow, such good stuff in this chat. Okay. Okay, thank you, doctor. Appreciate it. All right, so let's talk about microaggressions, micro insults, and micro assaults. And we won't spend a ton of time on here, but I feel like it's important for you to understand what those things are before you start the conversations. And then we're going to talk about the how for the last 20 minutes or so. Okay. And I want to leave some time for Q&A if you'd like. So first, microaggressions are microaggressions are things that people do and or say that are offensive to marginalized groups that they may not necessarily recognize are offensive. Okay. So microaggressions are things that if you're a part of a marginalized group, you probably feel microaggressions all the time and you just don't think about it, don't say about it. And the people who are doing it may not necessarily be conscious of the fact that they're doing it. Okay. And so I'll give a couple of, there are three different types of microaggressions that someone might experience. The first type is a micro assault. So a micro assault is when someone actually means to cause harm and they're very conscious of the fact that they're being aggressive. Okay. So an example of that would be like referring to someone as colored or oriental, using any of the racial epithets that you hear, deliberately serving a white patron before a person of color, displaying swastikas, um, refusing to acknowledge someone's pronouns is a micro assault. So all of those things where you know how a person feels about what you're doing and you continue to do it, those are micro assaults. Micro insults are a little bit harder to spot because it's the subtext that causes harm, although it isn't, that may not necessarily be the intent. And the perpetrator may be completely unaware that they're doing it. So one good example of this is, how did you get your job? Someone may ask, like a woman, like, how did you become CEO of this organization? Like the implication there is that you're not qualified as a woman to do that, right? Or as a person of color. I was on a panel recently where a young lady was sharing that she felt, she got a job and she felt, and someone told her that she was a diversity hire. And so she felt like they didn't respect the contribution that she was making to her company because the company was definitely looking to diversify their workforce. And I said to her, I said, what you probably should do is go back to that coworker and tell them that you are just as qualified as you are Black and that they should start looking at your work and not your color, right? So the micro insults are things that people say and they don't mean for it to be harmful, but it is very harmful. Another example is failing to call on female students in a math class or science class. Just assuming that they don't have answers. Now, honestly, I've experienced that in school. Nancy says, where does DEI didn't earn it fall in this chart? That is a micro assault. People are not unconscious of the fact that they are very conscious that they intend to cause harm when they say that. Another one is another micro insult would be something like, I had a student ask another student, like, are you like pray 5 times a day Muslim or like blow up the World Trade Center kind of Muslim? Like that was a very offensive question. They were thinking that that was kind of in jest. It was not. That was an insult. Okay. And if the person was a little bit more like, if they were really meant to harm, that would have been a micro assault. But that was a micro insult because they were like, oh, or if someone says like, oh, you're beautiful for an Asian girl, right? Like they don't mean for it to be an insult. It absolutely is. So that's my example of micro insult. Yeah, Nancy says not so micro, absolutely. And then the last is micro invalidation. And micro invalidation is when you exclude people. So not incorporating DEI is a micro invalidation in itself. Negating or nullifying the thoughts or feelings or experiences of people who are marginalized. So when people say, oh, well, I don't see color, then you're kind of saying that my experiences of prejudice are really kind of in my imagination, right? And so I know that was a thing that people say, oh, I just don't see color to say I don't really see diversity, but it really is kind of a micro invalidation. Or, just don't be so sensitive. Don't be so sensitive, right? I was on a call right at the beginning of COVID where there was this icebreaker, and one of the activities in the icebreaker was to pick what are you most looking forward to in the summer. And one of the options was working on your tan, right? And I was like, oh, well, that was kind of exclusive. That clearly that was an option that was considered for me, right? I'm not working on my tan in the summer. So all of those little ways that we and invalidate people. Another good example of a micro invalidation is, let's say that we're in a board meeting and Sarah's like, I feel like Jim just dismissed my comment. And Jim's like, you're just being sensitive. That is a micro invalidation. It's saying, oh, Sarah, all of this is in your imagination. It isn't real. I wasn't offensive. I don't need to take responsibility for my actions. So keep in mind that people who are marginalized experience microaggressions on a fairly regular basis. And I like to share that sometimes when you see someone react and you say like something happened or someone made a comment and you really overreacted, a lot of times they're not reacting to your comment. your comment was maybe the 10th microaggression they've experienced, and they're just at that breaking point. So keep that in mind. If a student is like kind of responding with a little bit more energy than you think, it may be because you're probably the nth microaggression they've experienced, maybe that day, maybe that week, maybe that month, right? So keep these in mind. And try to think about how, try to spot them in your community, try to spot them in things that you watch on TV. They're literally everywhere, happen all the time. Okay. So let's talk about checking ourselves. I think that this is really kind of an important thing to do. So when someone says, "Hey, I think that what you said was a little bit offensive," what is our normal reaction? What's the first thing most of us do when someone says we've done something that's offensive to them? What's our first reaction? Okay, Nancy says, "I apologize. Not intentional. Hopefully, apologize, get defensive or cry. Did not. Yeah, Nisa, that is exactly the answer I was looking for, right? Because if I cry, then I make myself the victim and I take it away from you, the person I've offended, right? And then if I just get defensive, it's like I'm invalidating what you're saying. So I would like to challenge all of you to challenge your team to take a different approach. And the approach is introspection, reflection, and action. And introspection is, oh, I love that, Janet. May I ask what it was? I'm not aware. I love that. I love that. Um, so introspection is asking yourself if you would have asked that question or made that statement to someone who was of your same social identity group. So introspection is first like, would I have asked that question of someone who is a Black female, right? For me. So introspection is asking yourself, would you have made that comment, made that assumption, taken that action if the person was in your same social identity group? The second part is reflection. And reflection is to think about, okay, so if I wouldn't have said that to another Black female, what programming or what narrative exists in my head that made me say that to this person? I'm going to give you an example so that this becomes a lot clearer. Okay. And then number three is to act on that. And action can be as simple as correcting the narrative in your mind and then apologizing to the person that you've offended. And I just want to be clear, an apology is not, I'm sorry if. That's the micro invalidation. An apology is, I am sorry that. Okay, so here's an example of this. I had a friend who is East Indian, born and raised in Ohio, went to Ohio State, like truly OHIO. Okay. She was walking her dog in Cleveland Heights, again, a very diverse community that I grew up in. We pride ourselves in our diversity and how we all get along interracially, right? And so she was walking her dog on a hot summer day and she was talking to a neighbor and she's like, "Oh my God, it's so hot out here." And he goes, "Yeah." He's like, "I bet it gets hotter than this back home." And so she called me and she was like, "What was that about?" And so if she had saw that neighbor the next day and asked him to engage in this process and said to him, like, that comment, that was kind of offensive to me because I think you made a lot of assumptions that aren't exactly true, right? So the first thing that he would have asked himself, the introspection part would have been, would I have made that comment if I was speaking to a white person, another white male? And then do you think that he would have made that comment to another white male? It's bet it gets hotter than this back home. No. And why? Why? Because we assume white people belong here, right? Like this is their country. We just assume. So then his introspection would be, or his reflection would be, what narrative exists in his mind that made him make that comment that she wasn't from here? And it is the automatic assumption that Americans are white. Like that is just an assumption that we make. Honestly, if you Google American, you have to go way down the page to get somebody who's not white. And I mean, honestly, so his reflection would be like, I wouldn't have asked this question of someone who was a white male. And I'm asking her because she's Indian. And so I'm assuming that she's not from here. Right. And so then his action would be to think like, I made an ignorant assumption. I need to not assume that people aren't from here just because they don't look like me. Right. And then the action would be to apologize to her for making that comment. Darren says, recognizing your programming from a lifetime of learned behavior filtered through the hegemonic capitalist lens takes time, a lot longer than a week. It takes a lot of time. And I think that we'll all continue to catch ourselves until this is more a part of our whole culture, right? So So thank you for that. That was a very good comment. Okay, so that's just a process. And actually we'll write this part out for you because it's not going to be on the slides that you get, but I'll write out what those pieces mean so that you have that. Okay. All right. So let's talk about creating that culture. So first, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to make a comment, and I want you to put if one is, I totally agree with that comment. And number 10 is, I find that comment so offensive. I want you to tell me, I want you to tell me where you would put yourself on a scale of 1 to 10. One is, I totally agree with this comment and I think it's fine. And 10 is that it's so offensive. There's no way I would agree with that comment. Okay. So the comment is, to a student who is Asian, where are you really from? Where are you really from? So I see 10s and 11s. Okay, so I have the right. I have a very, okay. All right. All right. So what about the comments? That's so gay. Scale of 1 to 10. Okay. What about the comments? Um, you're the least offensive Black guy I know. Like you're the least threatening Black guy I know. Okay. All right. So there are extremes here, right? But if I sent you a list of potential microaggressions, micro insults, micro invalidations, um, and had you, and I just read that list off, there would be spaces where some of us would say, oh, I think that that's a 1. I think that that's a 10, right? And so if we have that conversation a couple of times, we've just created a way for us to talk about comments. So I might say, so for, let's say the comment was that's okay. Let's say Sarah says that's a 10. And I'm like, well, it's a 2 for me. And so then I can say, so Sarah can say, well, Carmen, like I'm at a 10. I think that comment is very offensive. Why are you at a 2? And I might say, well, I mean, I have friends who are gay and they say that all the time and it doesn't really seem to bother them. And so I don't really think that it's really that offensive. And Sarah might say, well, Carmen, you're not gay, and I don't think you should be making that comment in the same way that I'm not going to use the N word because I'm not Black, right? And Sarah saying that comment might make me think, like, oh God, I didn't even think about it like that, right? Maybe I shouldn't be saying that. And so maybe Sarah might say, well, where do you think you are now? Do you still think you're a 2? And I might be like, you know, Sarah, okay, I think I'm at an 8 right now with that comment. That comment is an 8 for me. Okay. So this activity gives you an opportunity to have conversations with your staff or with your students where you're able to share the reasons that, because people don't know why something may be offensive. They might know why you're cute for an Asian girl. They might not know. They may not see that as offensive, right? Or I bet it's a lot hotter back home. They may not see why that comment would be offensive. And so this conversation, this activity gives you an opportunity to have a conversation about it, external comments, right? So it's not about Sarah and me. It's about what Sarah thinks about this objective, this outside comment, and what I think about this outside comment, right? So how many of you think, how many of you feel like you could facilitate a conversation with your staff, activity or conversation with your staff or with students around different ideas of diversity, where you could use this activity to start a conversation of how do we get closer to the middle? How do we bring each other? How do we make movement? Right. So Nancy, you feel like you could use it? How many of you think you could use this with your team? So let me tell you the benefit of this, of using this strategy. If you introduce this strategy in your class, or if you introduce this strategy among your staff, then that strategy can live on. It will grow legs and walk. Because then Sarah may say something to me that I think is offensive, and we don't even have to be in the room. And I might say, Sarah, listen, that comment you just made, that's a 7 for me. Now we have a strategy and a tool for having this conversation around diversity. So now Sarah might say, well, is this, that's a 7 for you? Like, that's like a 1 for me. Why is it a 7 for you? So now we have a way to talk about diversity and difference without it being about the person. We objectify the comment, not the commenter, right? So that comment was a 7 for me, and here's why. Okay. So it's kind of a way to kind of give you to operationalize a conversation around diversity that doesn't require a ton. Okay. So this next slide is really just an image that I like for people to keep in mind. And I love this image. I use it all the time. And what I like about it is a lens, and we're all viewing the world through our own lenses, right? And what's cool about this image is what's within our lens is crystal clear, right? It's what we, and it's all that we see. When we're looking through our own lens, we don't see everything else that's around it, or we don't see it as clearly as we see it through our own lens, right? So keep this image in mind as you're doing having these conversations, because even with that activity, someone has to see, like the purpose of the activity is to get people to see how you view it through your lens, but you also have to be willing to think about how they view it through their lens. Otherwise, it isn't a conversation. It isn't a conversation if it's all one way. So keep that in mind. You also have a very limited lens, and what's outside of your lens is fuzzy. So you need help broadening your view. We all need help broadening our view. Okay. All right. So let's talk about some steps for having courageous conversations. Norma says, honestly, I think everything may sound offensive now, just like food, everything causes cancer, may have a bacteria. So here's the thing. It is very possible for everything to sound offensive because darn it, I just fixed these bullets and they changed back to like all ones. I'm so sorry. There should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Excel and Google Slides don't play well with one another. So I think that uh, it's I think number one, we're paying more attention to things in light of whether something's offensive or not. And so I think it's a good thing if you feel like everything may sound offensive. And when people say that, like when men will say things like, "Oh my God, I guess it's not okay to even compliment a woman these days." I'm like, really? You really equating that with the whole Me Too thing? Like, you look nice today is not something that's going to get you pulled into HR. I think you know the difference between what's good and what's sleazy. You know what I'm saying? I don't think that Harvey Weinstein had any questions about his behavior. Like, it's not like that's such a thin line. Um, so I think, Nancy, thank you for that. So I think that if we're feeling like everything's offensive, then that means we're paying attention to the fact that things that we say may not be received as well from other people that they are from us. And I think makes us think about, like, you know, being a little bit more careful about how we say things, a little bit more conscious of how we say things. Okay, so Nancy's amening my all ones. I appreciate that. She says, I like all ones, they're all a priority. So part of having a courageous conversation is finding the right time. And finding the right time could be maybe after that event. The scenario we had earlier where the man was being disruptive, maybe confronting him during that scenario would only create more chaos and disrupt your efforts. And your CEO might say, you know what, look, the last time we did this, there was a big fight, and so we're not doing it, right? So finding the right time is really important. Um, and you also have to find the right time based on where you are. There are times when things have happened for me that if I had confronted it then, I would have been a typical angry Black woman. And it wouldn't be because I was angry, it was because I was hurt. And I, I had a lot of energy around that content. So sometimes I have to step away and say, this is a conversation I need to have, but I can't have this conversation with you today. We had a situation at my former employer where we had two candidates that we were looking at. One was Black, one was white. We were looking for a candidate who had a math science background, who had actual teacher training, and who seemed to really connect with the students in our community. And the Black candidate lived 5 minutes from our site. He was a science teacher and a special education teacher. And then we had a white candidate who had none of that background and was an hour late for his interview. So when we interviewed them, I thought naturally they're going to hire John, right? And we hired Scott. And I was just like, what? Like, we were looking for a math science person. We were looking for an educator. We were looking for someone who connected with this community. And we hired this guy, from Minnesota who'd never worked in an urban environment. We were smack dab in the middle of 98% poverty, 75% crime. Like, this is not the guy. And I couldn't talk to my supervisor and coworker about that hire for a couple of weeks because I think we hired the right candidate for my coworker. I don't think we hired the right candidate for my student. And I was really kind of angry about that decision in the beginning. And it wasn't that moment to have that conversation. I needed to have that conversation when I could kind of take my feelings out of it and talk about factually what happened. And so thinking about the right time and then being specific about your objective. Why are you having this conversation? Am I having this conversation because I want you to understand how I feel? Am I having this conversation because I feel like we need to make a different decision? Am I having this conversation because I'm trying to change your opinion? Am I having this conversation because we need to take this conversation to HR? So what is your objective? Do you want the person to hear you, or do you want them to hear and act? Be very clear about it so that they know upfront. Consider the other person's perspective. So you have to think about that if you have strong feelings about something, they have strong feelings about it too. Why might they have those strong feelings? Because sometimes that will help you bring your own emotions and energy down to think about what their perspective is. Another thing is to focus on observable behavior, because those are things that are a lot more objective. I can't say, well, you implied this. How do I improve what you were implying? Or how do I improve your intent? I can't. But what I can say is you were disruptive during the session. You didn't come back from breaks on time. You kept interrupting all of the people who were stating something that was different than what you believe. You did, I'm listing actual behaviors that I saw, that I heard, or you said this. It's hard for people to deny the things that you that they physically did, that you physically saw, that they said, that you heard. So think about those, focus on the observable behavior and not the intent and emotion behind it. And then also focus on the impact. And sometimes we get derailed by the intent. Well, so Sarah might say, well, Carmen, when you said such and such, that offended this person, that person. And I could say, oh, well, I didn't mean to offend anybody by that comment. Doesn't matter that I didn't intend to. What matters is that I did. Okay. And that's when you go back to that introspection, reflection, and action, right? Like, okay, would I have made that comment? Like, I hear that they're saying this is offensive. Would I have said that to someone? Like, okay, maybe I wouldn't have. Then why did I say that? Here's a narrative that exists in my mind. Okay, I got to go back and I have to apologize. And then I need to think about how I'm thinking about, whatever. Okay. So so these are part of the steps to having a conversation. So I want to pause here and just ask, are there any questions? There are a couple of other things that I can share, but I do want to give a moment if there are any questions anyone wants to put in the chat, just to address those really quickly. Outside of you, you're going to get the recording, you will get the handouts, and I will do the handout about the introspection, reflection, action. Any other questions before I move on? There are a couple of other slides that I want to share really quickly. No? Okay. Right. Yes. I will send that to Sarah too. Okay. So the bottom line, I think, for all of this is that you create a culture for having courageous conversations by, one, finding an objective way to have the conversations, two, having them frequently, and then really making sure that you're intentional about when you have them, what your objectives are, what perspectives are all represented, having observable behavior. I also think that sometimes it's helpful to have a third person. So if I'm having a conversation around some things, it might help to have someone who can mediate and who can say, okay, listen, like right now you're listening to you're stating your opinion, but I don't really necessarily hear you speaking to one another. Or having some folks on your team who are able to kind of coach those conversations can also be really helpful. Okay, so a couple of other things that I want to share, just because, and these were just things I added in case we had time. The first is that, so when you think about critical social justice literacy, that's really just kind of having the mindset to be able to participate and facilitate difficult conversations. So a couple of things that I think we should keep in mind is that social groups in our country are not valued equally in our society. Women, men, Black, white, wealthy, poor, native born, foreign, social groups matter in this country. And the social groups that are valued more highly tend to have access to more resources, to more privilege. And so there really is still social injustice in our society. And we have to start by acknowledging that exists, because you have to If you don't acknowledge that part of it, it's hard to engage in this work. And then you also have to know that action is something that is ongoing and lifelong. We're always checking ourselves, we're always checking other people, we're always learning more information and trying to increase our broaden our perspectives. And the things that we have to do as social justice practitioners, critical social justice practitioners, is that we have to recognize that these relationships of unequal social power, they're always being enacted individually and within larger systems, right? They're always in place. And then we have to understand our own position. Where do we have power? Where do we have privilege? Where do we lack power? And then how do we leverage that power for the benefit of other people? We have to think critically about knowledge. What do we know about situations? What do we know about our history? How do we know it? Can we trust the sources that that information came from? How do we think critically about that? And then, um, and we act on all of those things in the service of a more socially just society, which is what our work is. Our work is saying, our students came through the system. The system wasn't designed for all of them to succeed. And our work is trying to right that wrong. So we are social justice actors, whether we call ourselves that or not. That's the work that we're doing. Okay. So some guidelines for social justice conversations. Strive for intellectual humility, which means you're not always going to be right. Approach the conversation with a opportunity, with a goal of learning something from the other person. That's another ground rule for trying to build a culture for courageous conversations. Number two, distinguish between your opinion and actual knowledge, because we all have opinions, but our opinions aren't all rooted in fact. So try to keep your conversation focused on what you actually know. um, Look at broader societal patterns instead of looking for exceptions. So I might, if someone on your staff says, "Oh, well, I feel like racism is a problem on our staff," you might go, "Well, this happened. This you got promoted yesterday. Like, yeah, that happened yesterday, but here are the things I experience every other day that I'm here." So look for the patterns and not for the exceptions. Also, know that your reactions, when you're reacting to something, that's an opportunity for you to really learn a little bit more about yourself. Why am I acting so strongly to what someone just said or to what just happened or to this interaction? And then recognize how your social position informs your reaction, right? And so sometimes our position of privilege, when our position of privilege is threatened, it's like, "Well, what do you mean?" So if someone says, "Well, I think that you're being discriminatory because you're not disabled," I'm like, "Well, no, why would I wouldn't do." We have to recognize that, what, my social position does create some privilege here, and I am acting on that privilege, and I am not looking at how you're being disadvantaged. Okay, so these are all from a book called "Is Everyone Really Equal" by Sensoi and D'Angelo. And D'Angelo is Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility. And I honestly, I read this book. My class was required to read it when I taught at Cleveland State University. I didn't really like her approach to the book. I felt like it was too in your face. I felt like it would turn a lot of people off. And I was very, very careful using that book with my students because I didn't want them to think that I owned her viewpoints and that. So just a little disclaimer there. So when you having a conversation about someone, you might ask, "Well, how did you perceive that interaction that we just had? Like, how did you see that?" Right? And then listen and learn. Listen to try to understand what it is. So the both is for both of us to learn something a little bit. And then think about what are some clear steps that you can take to move your conversation forward. And then you might want to set up a time for a follow-up conversation. Like, here's where we are. Let's have this conversation. I want to hear what your perspective is. I'm trying to really learn from you. So here's what we're going to do next. And let's check back in with each other in a week or two and see where things are. Because keeping that conversation going is how you create the culture for courageous conversations. Okay. Last thing is I just want to invite you all to join I moderate the diversity, equity, and inclusion group for the literacy information communication system. We have conversations like this on there all the time. We try to bring up topics that you might want to think about and consider. So please consider joining that on links.ed.gov. And then last is just my contact information. Let's see. Okay, perfect. That was just from Elizabeth. Thank you all so much for your interest in this topic, for taking 90 minutes out of your day to come and learn about it, for all of the wonderful participation in the chat. I really appreciated all of that. And I thank you all. Thank you, Sarah, for this opportunity and for Nancy, so she had all day. I could talk all day. Okay, great. Thank you all so much.
Thank you everyone for participating today. I have put the follow-up survey in the chat. That follow-up survey will also be sent out with your email you will be receiving in the next couple of days. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.